Chapter 8. Numbered Days. I Hardly Know Truman. Franklin Roosevelt, July 1944. 1. It was in early summer of 1943, 1 year in advance of the Democratic National Convention, that Senator Truman recorded on paper for the first time that in some circles he was being talked of as a candidate for vice president, assuming the president were to run for a fourth term. He had been invited to Sunday lunch at the Washington home of Senator Joe Guffey, a staunch New Dealer who took him out into the garden to ask, very confidentially, what he thought of Vice President Henry Wallace. Truman had smiled and said Wallace was the best Secretary of Agriculture the country ever had. Guffey, laughing, said that was what he thought, too. Then he wanted to know if I would help out the ticket if it became necessary by accepting the nomination for vice president, Truman recorded. I told him in words of one syllable that I would not. And although the idea was talked about with increasing frequency thereafter, Truman, when asked his opinion, always gave the same answer. He wanted to stay in the Senate. Moreover, he believed in being realistic. Franklin Roosevelt had shown no sign of dissatisfaction with the vice president, nor any inclination to abandon him. And even if Roosevelt were to change his mind, there were a number of others, Jimmy Burns and Alben Barkley, to name the two most obvious possibilities, who were better known, more experienced, and who would leap to the opportunity. Jimmy Burns, a small, tidy, vivid man whom Truman greatly admired, was a Southerner, a lapsed Catholic, and 66 years old, all of which could count against him. But he had done virtually everything there was to do in government, his experience ranging across all three branches, beginning with 7 terms in the House before going to the Senate. Named to the Supreme Court in 1941, Burns had resigned after only 1 term to become Roosevelt's War Mobilization Director, with an office in the East Wing of the White House. Popularly referred to as Assistant President, he was the consummate insider whose political judgment, whose ability to funnel money where needed in the party, such as to Senator Truman in 1940, were thought second to none. Roosevelt relied heavily on him and liked him. By contrast to such a man as Burns, Truman was small potatoes, as he well knew, and no closer to Roosevelt now than he had ever been. In fact, lately a distinct chill had been felt at the White House concerning Truman, ever since publication in American Magazine of a ghost-written article about the findings of the committee that Truman had allowed to be published under his name without bothering to read it very carefully. Too late he had discovered how critical it was of the administration's handling of the war effort. Leadership is what we Americans are crying for, the article said. We are fighting mad and ready to tackle any job and to make any sacrifice. All we ask is that we be intelligently and resolutely led. He was certain that the president didn't like him, Truman told friends in the Senate. Still, the vice presidential speculation continued, and with Truman's name spoken often, for the reason that certain influential figures in the Democratic Party had joined in a pact to keep Henry Wallace off the ticket. They were only a handful, only a half-dozen or so to begin with, but they were among the most powerful men in the party, and they had taken it upon themselves to talk down Wallace at every opportunity and begin organizing wider opposition to him. They included the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Frank Walker, who had replaced Jim Farley as Postmaster General, Ed Pauley, a wealthy California oil man who was treasurer of the National Committee, George E. Allen, a jovial man about Washington, lobbyist and secretary of the National Committee, and Robert E. Hannigan, Truman's last-minute savior in the 1940 campaign, who had since advanced to Commissioner of Internal Revenue and was now not only a great favorite of the president's, but in line to replace Walker as national chairman. General Edwin Pa Watson, Appointments Secretary at the White House, had also agreed to clear the way whenever possible for anti-Wallace Democrats to see the president. Watson, it was hoped, could serve as counterbalance to Mrs. Roosevelt, a known champion of the vice president. But the key man in the conspiracy was Edward Joseph Flynn of the Bronx, who, since the downfall of Tom Pendergast, was considered the most powerful political boss in the country, and who in looks and manner bore little resemblance to the usual picture of a successful Irish politician. At 52, Flynn was tall and handsome, with thinning gray hair and gray eyes, beautifully dressed, well-educated, an ardent gardener, a student of history. Most importantly, he was a devoted friend of Franklin Roosevelt, and his influence on Roosevelt on political matters exceeded that of anyone inside or out of the administration. It was Ed Flynn who ran the president's successful bid for a third term in 1940, and it was Ed Flynn now, more than any of the others, who saw defeat in November unless something was done about the vice president. For Henry Wallace was not their idea of a politician. Henry Wallace was one of the most serious-minded, fascinating figures in national public life, a plant geneticist by profession who had done important work in the development of hybrid corn and whose pioneer hybrid corn company was a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He was an author, lecturer, social thinker, a firm advocate for civil rights, and thorough New Dealer with a large, devoted following. With the exception of Franklin Roosevelt, he was the most popular Democrat in the country. Those who loved him saw him as one of the rare men of ideas in politics and the prophet of a truly democratic America. But he was also an easy man to make fun of, and to these tough party professionals, Wallace seemed to have his head in the clouds. They had never wanted him for vice president. He had been forced upon them in 1940 when Roosevelt threatened not to run again unless he could have Wallace as his running mate. Wallace was too intellectual, a mystic who spoke Russian and played with a boomerang and reputedly consulted with the spirit of a dead Sioux Indian chief. As vice president, he seemed pathetically out of place and painfully lacking in political talent or even a serious interest in politics. When not presiding over the Senate, he would often shut himself in his office and study Spanish. He was too remote, too controversial, too liberal, much too liberal, which was the main charge against him. Of the group, only Ed Flynn appears to have personally admired Wallace and his ideas, but as the political writer Richard Rovere observed of Flynn, he considered candidates only as good as their chances of winning. None of this would have mattered greatly had the president said Wallace was again his choice, but Roosevelt preferred to let things slide. His mind was on the war. He was also just as happy to keep everyone guessing as long as possible. The first meeting with Roosevelt to discuss the advisability of ditching Wallace took place at the White House in January 1944, 6 months in advance of the National Convention, and Truman's name figured prominently in a discussion of alternative choices that included Burns, Barclay, Sam Rayburn, Ambassador John G. Winant, Senator Sherman Minton, and Justice William O. Douglas, who had replaced the late Louis D. Brandeis on the Supreme Court. It was Hannigan who had the most to say about Truman, but Hannigan appeared equally enthusiastic about Burns, and as a whole the group was more against Wallace than for any one possible replacement. Roosevelt declined to give a clear sign of what he wanted. As the historian James McGregor Burns, then a member of the White House staff, later wrote, Roosevelt never pursued a more Byzantine course than in his handling of this question. Truman, who was party to none of the discussions, thought Sam Rayburn would be the best nominee and said so publicly. By spring, Jimmy Burns looked like the clear favorite at the White House, though Wallace was leading in the polls. Harry Hopkins, the only one closer to Roosevelt than Burns, made a point of telling Burns that Roosevelt very much hoped he would be on the ticket. Flying home from the Tehran conference, looking out at the stars, Hopkins had asked the president who he thought would be the best man to take over his duties if something happened to the plane and it went down. Jimmy Burns, Roosevelt said without hesitation. When Burns appeared reluctant to try for the job, others began putting pressure on him. For by then there was concern over more than just losing votes in November. The president's declining health could no longer be ignored, though in wartime nothing on the matter could be said publicly. After a bout of so-called walking pneumonia in April, Roosevelt, with much wartime secrecy, went to Bernard Baruch's estate in South Carolina for what was supposed to have been a 2-week rest, but that stretched to a month. Seeing the president after his return to the White House, Ed Flynn was so alarmed by his appearance that he urged Mrs. Roosevelt to use her influence to keep him from running again. I felt, Flynn later said, that he would never survive his term. Ed Pauley would say that his own determination to unseat Wallace came strictly from the conviction that Wallace was not a fit man to be president, and by my belief on the basis of continuing observation that President Roosevelt would not live much longer. George Allen, remembering these critical months just before the 1944 convention, wrote that every one of their group realized that the man nominated to run with Roosevelt would in all probability be the next president. The worry aroused by the president's appearance was more than justified. His condition was worse than all but very few were aware of. Secretly, he was under the constant supervision of a cardiologist, who after a thorough examination in March reported that given proper care he might live a year. In May, Roosevelt sent Henry Wallace on a mission to China, which many took as a sign that Wallace was finished. Then, in early June, just after news of the Allied landings at Normandy, and with only a month to go before the convention, Hannigan dropped in on Burns at the White House, where for several hours he tried to convince Burns to become a candidate for vice president. The president himself, Hannigan said, had told him Burns was the man he had really wanted as his running mate in 1940, and that he would rather have Burns on the ticket this time than anybody. Later, Pa Watson telephoned Burns to confirm everything Hannigan had said. On June 27th, Hannigan took things a step further. He told Roosevelt that Wallace had to come off the ticket. All he had to do, Hannigan said to the president, was to agree to Jimmy Burns, and they could sail through the convention and the election. "That suits me fine," Roosevelt responded. "He was my candidate for vice president 4 years ago, at the 1940 convention, but religion got messed up in it." "That won't matter a damn bit," Hannigan answered. "I am a Catholic, and I can talk on that subject." While Truman had been a great backer of Hannigan ever since the 1940 Senate race, it was Burns, with his influence with Roosevelt, who had had the most say in making Hannigan Commissioner of Internal Revenue and now the new chairman of the Democratic Party. Roosevelt asked Burns to go with him to Shangri-La, the presidential retreat in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland, to talk campaign strategy for a few days, after which, wrote Burns, "I did conclude that he was sincere in wanting me for his running mate." Yet at the time, at the end of a long day, Burns also remarked to one of his aides, "Now, partner, let's not get too excited about this vice president business. I know that man, FDR, more than anybody else." Asked by 2 or 3 of his staff who were gathered about his desk what he thought of Harry Truman, Roosevelt said he didn't know much about him. But Henry J. Kaiser, the famous shipbuilder, he said, was somebody else we have got up our sleeve. Having completed a cross-country survey at Roosevelt's request, Ed Flynn told him that opposition to Wallace was greater even than anyone supposed. Both Flynn and Roosevelt knew the election in the fall would be close, but Roosevelt was by no means a certain winner. Wallace on the ticket, Flynn warned, could mean the loss of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and California, which was undoubtedly an exaggeration. The problem was to find someone who would hurt Roosevelt's chances least. So together, according to Flynn's subsequent account, the 2 of them ran down the list, weighing the negative sides of all the other candidates. Burns was the strongest choice, Flynn agreed, but Burns, who had been raised a Catholic, had left the church when he married to become an Episcopalian, and in Flynn's view the Catholics wouldn't stand for that. Organized labor had no enthusiasm for Burns, since he had opposed sit-down strikes in wartime. But far more serious to Flynn was Burns's Southern background and recorded positions on racial issues. This was the crucial flaw. In 1938, Burns had been in the forefront of those Southern senators fighting against a proposed federal anti-lynching law, and in a speech on the Senate floor he had turned much of his fire on Walter White, head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. "The Negro has not only come into the Democratic Party," Burns had said, "but the Negro has come into control of the Democratic Party." Then, pointing to the gallery where White was sitting, Burns exclaimed, "If Walter White should consent to have this bill laid aside, its advocates would desert it as quickly as football players unscramble when the whistle of the referee is heard." When asked who he thought should run with Roosevelt, Burns usually mentioned Truman, Rayburn, and Henry J. Kaiser. Sam Rayburn was a good man, Flynn and Roosevelt agreed, but Rayburn was from Texas, another Southerner, and so couldn't be considered. When they went through the list of the entire Senate, only one fitted the picture, Harry Truman. As Flynn wrote, "His record as head of the Senate committee was excellent. His labor votes in the Senate were good. On the other hand, he seemed to represent to some degree the conservatives in the party. He came from a border state, and he had never made any racial remarks. He just dropped into the slot." Flynn left the White House convinced he had an agreement, that Roosevelt saw Truman as the one who would do the ticket the least harm. This was not exactly a rousing endorsement for the senator from Missouri, but it was what Flynn had wanted to hear, which is probably the main reason Roosevelt, given his manner of operation, sent him on his way with that impression. About this same time, Roosevelt asked a favor of Mrs. Anna Rosenberg, a member of the War Mobilization Advisory Board, whose office, like that of Burns, was in the East Wing. Mrs. Rosenberg had become a favorite of the president's. A highly attractive woman, she dressed smartly, wore expensive perfume, and lent an air of femininity to the White House that he greatly welcomed. In contrast to Mrs. Roosevelt, she also appreciated good food and would on occasion smuggle in jars of caviar to the president, sometimes also baskets of paprika chicken cooked by her Hungarian mother, which she and Roosevelt would happily devour together in his office in secret, like naughty children, she would remember. Roosevelt told her now that Burns was the best man, but asked her to go tell Burns he was not to be the vice presidential choice because of the Negro vote. Mrs. Rosenberg, who admired Burns greatly and wanted him on the ticket, said she couldn't do that. If the president wanted Burns to know he had no chance, then the president would have to tell him himself, she said. But Roosevelt never did, never could, as she knew. Truman was trying to clear up his work and get away for a few days in Missouri before the convention opened in Chicago on July 19th. With so little time remaining, gossip over the vice presidential question had become intense. To any and all who asked if he was interested in the nomination, Truman said no. No, no, no. The whole matter was getting on his nerves. He had not seen the president. It had been more than a year since he had seen the president. Nor would he make any effort to do so now. "I don't want to be vice president," he told William Helm as they were rushing along a hall in the Senate office building, and, as Helm wrote later, anyone who saw the look on his face would have known he meant it. The number of other Democrats in the Senate reputedly in the running had grown to such a list, reporters were joking, that it was easier to tally those who were not candidates. On July 6th, to judge by corridor gossip, Wallace had the nomination sewed up. On July 7th, the word from informed sources was that the president wanted Wallace, but he also wanted 3 or 4 acceptable names held in reserve should the convention refuse to swallow Henry. In that case, Barclay was first choice. On July 9th, it was noted that Senator Truman, by continuing to do battle with the War Production Board and the Armed Services, was killing whatever chance he might have had. "The vice president simply presides over the Senate and sits around hoping for a funeral," Truman explained to a friend. "It is a very high office which consists entirely of honor, and I don't have any ambition to hold an office like that." Max Lowenthal and Les Biffle were after him to run for vice president. "The madam doesn't want me to do it," he told Lowenthal. To Margaret he wrote, "It is funny how some people would give a fortune to be as close as I am to it, and I don't want it." Then, making it unmistakable that his thoughts, too, were on the obvious mortality of Franklin Roosevelt, not to say his own advancing years, he added, 1600 Pennsylvania is a nice address, but I'd rather not move in through the back door, or any other door at 60. The letter was written on July 9th, just as he started the long drive home alone to Missouri. On Monday, July 10th, after an all-night flight from Seattle, an exhausted Vice President of the United States arrived in Washington at the end of a 51-day, 27,000-mile mission to China, and at 4:30 that afternoon he met with the President to report on what he had seen. Roosevelt was cordial, as always. For a long while they talked about China and Wallace's venture to Outer Mongolia, where no American had set foot in 17 years. Wallace had brought Roosevelt some Mongolian stamps for his collection. As Wallace recorded in his diary, it was Roosevelt who at last opened up on politics, saying that when I went out I should say that no politics were discussed. Roosevelt assured Wallace that he was his choice as running mate and that he intended the 4th term to be really progressive. He talked of the professional politicians who thought Wallace might mean a loss of 2 or 3 million votes, figures Ed Flynn had supplied. "Mr. President," Wallace interjected, "if you can find anyone who will add more strength to the ticket than I, by all means take him." Roosevelt warned Wallace of the ordeal he might face at Chicago, trying to get the vice presidential nomination, and expressed concern about the pain this could mean for Wallace's family. "Think of the catcalls and jeers and the definiteness of rejection," Roosevelt remarked. Wallace said he was not worried about his family. The next day, Tuesday, July 11th, the President announced formally that he was running for another term. Young Allen Drury wrote that he would never forget the look on the faces of Democratic senators when the news reached the Hill. It was as though the sun had burst from the clouds and glory surrounded the world. Relief, and I mean relief, was written on every face. The meal ticket was still the meal ticket, and all was well with the party. At lunch that day, July 11th, Hopkins again asked Roosevelt who he thought would make the best president, Burns or William O. Douglas. "Jimmy Burns," Roosevelt said, "because he knows more about government than anybody around." Hopkins asked who the president thought would win the nomination if the convention were left free to decide. "Burns," Roosevelt said again. Then that night, following dinner, in the president's blue oval study on the second floor of the White House, the full anti-Wallace coalition, Flynn, Hannigan, Walker, Allen, Pauley, plus one more exceptionally influential practical politician, Mayor Ed Kelly of Chicago, gathered with the president for what they were to regard as the decisive meeting. Because of the muggy heat, everyone was in shirt sleeves. Drinks were passed, and again the full list of vice presidential possibilities was taken up one by one. Again Burns and Rayburn were rejected. Now, for the first time, Barclay, too, was ruled out, and by Roosevelt, because Barclay was too old. Like Burns, Barclay was 66, which made him Roosevelt's senior by only 4 years, but the Republicans at their convention in Chicago had just nominated for president Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York, who was all of 42, the age Roosevelt's Republican cousin Theodore had been when he took office, and so age could very likely be an issue in the campaign. Roosevelt thought a young man was needed on the Democratic ticket, and to the surprise of the others, he proposed William O. Douglas, an idea none of them had ever seriously entertained. Douglas, he said, was youthful, he was 53, dynamic, a good liberal, and he had a kind of Boy Scout quality that would appeal to voters. Besides, Roosevelt thought, Douglas played an interesting game of poker. But the idea fell flat. No one wanted Douglas any more than Wallace. Again the talk turned to Harry Truman, Roosevelt contributing little to the conversation except to observe that he had set Truman up in his committee, which was not so, and thought he was doing a commendable job. Truman was able and loyal to the administration, Roosevelt agreed, and wise to the way of politics. Reportedly, the question of Truman's association with the Pendergast machine was thoroughly discussed and dismissed as irrelevant. Only one point troubled the president, Truman's age. He was not sure, Roosevelt said, but he thought Truman was nearly 60. Hannigan, who knew Truman was already 60, tried to change the subject, but Roosevelt sent for a congressional directory and the conversation continued. When the directory arrived, Ed Pauley quietly took it and said no more. As to which candidate might be best suited and prepared for the burdens and responsibilities of the presidency, there appears to have been little or no discussion. Apparently only Roosevelt touched on the subject, saying again that all in all, Jimmy Burns was the best qualified man. It would also be remembered how tired and listless the president was all through the stifling hot evening. Frank Walker commented later that he had never known Roosevelt to stand so willingly on the sidelines and let others carry the ball. Exhausted he was, and preoccupied by the war. Since the Allied landings at Normandy on June 6th, the Germans had launched their first V-1 rockets, Hitler's terrifying Vergeltungswaffe, the vengeance weapon, against London. In the Pacific, the American assault on the island of Saipan had been met with Japanese resistance as fierce as any since the fighting began. Just the week before, on the night of July 6th, 3,000 Japanese had hurled themselves against the 27th Division in one mass banzai charge, all to be killed. No one, and least of all Roosevelt, expected the final stages of the war to become anything but more and more costly. At last, turning to Hannigan, Roosevelt said, "Bob, I think you and everyone else here want Truman." Roosevelt had not said yet whether he himself wanted Truman, but at this point, Ed Pauley, still holding the congressional directory, rose and suggested they break up, then hurried everybody out of the room before Roosevelt had a chance to say anything more. Downstairs, as they were about to leave, Hannigan decided to go back up and get something in writing. By several accounts, he returned with a note that Roosevelt had scrawled on an envelope. "Bob, I think Truman is the right man, FDR." But an offhand personal note was hardly conclusive, and as George Allen observed in understatement, Roosevelt was still free to change his mind. A day or so later, writing in his diary, Harold Ickes, the Secretary of Interior, recorded that in a conversation with the President about the vice-presidential issue, little had been said about Senator Truman. "I gathered that he felt as I do," wrote Ickes, "that Truman might do, but that he might raise a political boss issue that would be especially welcomed by Dewey, whose rise to political prominence has been due to fighting political bosses." It was a pattern. No matter how many talked to Roosevelt on the subject, each and all came away feeling he thought just as they did. For the moment, anyway. At first chance the morning of Wednesday, July 12th, Hannigan went to see Henry Wallace at his apartment at the Wardman Park, a mission undertaken, according to Hannigan's later account, at the request of the President. He told Wallace he would be a detriment to the ticket and must therefore withdraw. Wallace said they might as well understand one another. He was not withdrawing as long as the President preferred him. On Thursday the 13th, Wallace met for lunch with Roosevelt, who reported the meeting of the night of the 11th in some detail, explaining the preference of the professional politicians for Truman as the only one who had no enemies and might add a little independent strength to the ticket. Wallace showed him a new Gallup poll reporting 65% of Democratic voters in favor of Wallace, while Burns had but 3%, Truman 2%. The only other potential candidate with even a modest showing was Alban Barkley, with 17%. It was his intention, Roosevelt said, to send a letter to the chairman of the convention, Senator Samuel Jackson, saying that if he were a delegate, he would vote for Wallace. Would he offer any alternative name, Wallace asked. No, Roosevelt assured him, he would not. The vice president stood to leave. At 55, he was slim and fit, a man who was regularly out of bed at 5:30 in the morning to play tennis. Yet he had an untidy look, which, with his underlying shyness and the shock of reddish-gray hair that hung over the right side of his forehead, made him seem almost rustic, and so entirely different from the seated president. "Well, I am looking ahead with pleasure to the results of next week, no matter what the outcome," Wallace said. Roosevelt, his head up, beaming, drew Wallace close, and with a vigorous handclasp said, "While I cannot put it just that way in public, I hope it will be the same old team." In another exchange earlier that same morning, Roosevelt had told Jimmy Burns he was certain Wallace could not win at Chicago, but that he would endorse no candidate other than Wallace. Burns pointed out that he had not allowed himself to become seriously interested until Bob Hannigan had told him, in effect, that he was the president's first choice. On the question of his standing with black voters, Burns said only that he didn't think that would matter when all was said and done. He showed the president a photograph he had just received from Aiken, South Carolina, in which Mrs. Roosevelt was seen addressing a group of blacks. "Look at the expressions on their faces," Burns said. "That is idolatry. You can't tell me that because you have a Southerner on the ticket that those people are going to turn against Mrs. Roosevelt and the president who have done more for them than anybody." Roosevelt said he thought Burns was right. "Mr. President, all I have heard around this White House for the last week is Negro. I wonder if anybody ever thinks about the white people. Did you ever stop to think who would do the most for the Negro? This is a serious problem, but it will have to be solved by the white people of the South." He wanted an open convention, Roosevelt said, which Burns, understandably, took to mean that he himself had every chance for the nomination. "You are the best qualified man in the whole outfit, and you must not get out of the race," Roosevelt told him. "If you stay in, you are sure to win." Meeting with Hannigan and Frank Walker for lunch the next day, Burns repeated what Roosevelt had said. Hannigan was incredulous. "I don't understand it," he said. Neither did Burns, who, determined to settle the matter, returned to his White House office and put through a call to Roosevelt, who by this time was at his home in Hyde Park, New York. Burns, who had once been a court stenographer, took down their conversation in shorthand. Roosevelt said again he was not favoring anybody. "I told them so. No, I am not favoring anybody." Burns: "Bob Hannigan and Frank Walker stated today that if at the convention they were asked about your views, they would be obliged to say to their friends that from your statements they concluded you did not prefer Wallace but did prefer Truman first and Douglas second, and that either would be preferable to me because they would cost the ticket fewer votes than I would." Roosevelt: "Jimmy, that is all wrong. That is not what I told them. It is what they told me. When we all went over the list, I did not say I preferred anybody or that anybody would cost me votes, but they all agreed that Truman would cost fewer votes than anybody, and probably Douglas second. This was the agreement they reached, and I had nothing to do with it." Burns pressed him. If Hannigan and his friends were to release any kind of statement saying the president preferred Truman and Douglas, that could make things very difficult for his own cause. "We have to be damn careful about language," Roosevelt answered. "They asked if I would object to Truman and Douglas, and I said no. That is different from using the word prefer. That is not expressing a preference because you know I told you I would have no preference." Roosevelt asked Burns whether he would try for the nomination. Burns said he was considering it, but he needed to know the president's views. Roosevelt replied, "After all, Jimmy, you are close to me personally, and Henry is close to me. I hardly know Truman. Douglas is a poker partner. He is good in a poker game and tells good stories." Finishing the call, Burns went directly down the corridor to Hopkins's office and repeated what the president had said. If anyone knew Roosevelt's mind, supposedly it was Hopkins, who now told Burns the president was sure that if Burns entered the race he would win, he would be nominated. According to Burns, it was then that he phoned Harry Truman in Missouri, though Truman would remember the call coming early in the morning, as he was about to leave for Chicago. Whether this was Friday morning or Saturday morning is not clear, nor important, but presumably Burns would not have called Truman until after he had talked with the president, so most likely it was Saturday morning. Truman was staying at the President Hotel in Kansas City. Bess Margaret and Madge Wallace were visiting Fred Wallace at his new home in Denver. Burns asked if Truman was serious when he told the newspapers he did not want the vice presidential nomination. "Yes," Truman replied, "absolutely. He was not a candidate." Burns said he had been given the go sign from Roosevelt and would like nothing better than to have Truman make the nominating speech for him at Chicago. Truman accepted at once, saying he would be delighted and would do all he could to line up the Missouri delegation. Clearly, he too was convinced by this time that Burns was both the president's choice and the best one, and his source for such confidence must have been Bob Hannigan. Otherwise he would never have responded so affirmatively and without hesitation. Again, by Truman's recollection, he had no sooner put down the phone than it rang a second time. Alban Barkley now wanted him to make his nominating speech at Chicago. He was sorry, Truman replied, but he had just said yes to Jimmy Burns. 2. The turmoil at the Chicago Convention was entirely over the vice presidency, and at no time did the outcome appear inevitable. Ambitions were too large, the opportunities for deceit and maneuver and the play of emotion too plentiful, the dictates of Franklin Roosevelt too capricious and uncertain, for there to have been even a momentary sense of events moving as if on a track. Things could have gone differently at any of several points, and with the most far-reaching consequences. As Alban Barkley would write, the denouement in Chicago of all the plotting that had gone on in Washington was a fascinating political drama. It was politics for the highest stakes, politics at its slipperiest, and the only real drama of either national convention that summer. A few weeks before, when the Republicans filled the same hotels and picked their nominees in the same steaming hall, there had been no contest and no surprises. Thomas E. Dewey was smoothly nominated on the first ballot, and his only near rival, Senator John W. Bricker, was the choice for running mate. Now the assembling Democrats were to be denied the chance even to see their standard-bearer, their hero, whose overwhelming endorsement for yet another term was a foregone conclusion. Roosevelt had declined to appear before the convention because of his duties as commander-in-chief, he said, just as he had agreed to run again because he saw it as his duty as a good soldier in time of war. His acceptance speech was to be delivered by radio hookup from some undisclosed location on the West Coast. But as so many of the Democrats who converged on Chicago understood, the task of choosing a vice president had unique importance this time. The common, realistic, and not unspoken view was that they were there to pick not one but two presidents, and if the identity of the first was clear, that of the second was not. Had there been a poll of the delegates as they checked in at the hotels, the choice of the majority would have been Henry Wallace. I.F. Stone, writing in The Nation, said that on the basis of his inside sources, he could report for certain it would be Wallace. Yet the eminent radio commentator H.V. Kaltenborn virtually announced the nomination of Alban Barkley, while Arthur Kroc of the New York Times said the prime contenders after Wallace were Burns, Barkley, and Douglas in that order, and made no mention of Harry Truman. Speaking for the Democratic National Committee, George Allen thought it would be Truman, but he couldn't be sure. Hannigan and Mayor Kelly, meantime, two of the most powerful figures on the committee, had concluded it would be Burns. But of course nobody really knew, since so much depended on Franklin Roosevelt, and as George Allen also aptly observed, Roosevelt could of course have named anybody. Privately, and as he would tell no one until much later, Truman thought it would be Wallace. Looking back on what happened, Alban Barkley would conclude that he had been sadly naive about the whole business. He had been in politics nearly 40 years. This was his 11th national convention, but he had never seen anything like what went on. Truman drove to Chicago from Kansas City on Saturday, July 15th, 4 days before the convention was officially to open, and the same day the president's westbound train made an unscheduled stop at Chicago. As later disclosed, Roosevelt was en route to San Diego, where a cruiser would take him to Hawaii for meetings with General Douglas MacArthur. But at 3 that afternoon, his train was shunted onto a siding so that Bob Hannigan could come aboard for a private talk in the president's new armor-plated private railroad car, the Ferdinand Magellan, another innovation resulting from the war. They were together approximately half an hour. The train stood in the Chicago yards during this conference, and none of us showed ourselves outside, wrote the president's secretary, Grace Tully. Though nearly everything said between Roosevelt and Hannigan was kept secret, one request by Roosevelt would become the best-known line of the convention. Whatever was decided, said the president, Hannigan must first clear it with Sidney, meaning that Sidney Hillman was to have the final say. Hillman, who now ran the CIO's Well-Heeled Political Action Committee, or PAC, which was something new in American politics. Hannigan also came off the train with a letter on White House stationery, which, in lieu of a briefcase, he carried inside a copy of the National Geographic magazine. The letter was post-dated July 19th. Dear Bob, you have written me about Harry Truman and Bill Douglas. I should, of course, be very glad to run with either of them and believe that either one of them would bring real strength to the ticket. Always sincerely, Franklin Roosevelt. Whether it had been written earlier in Washington or was produced to order that day is not certain. Grace Tully, however, said Hannigan had come out of the president's sitting room with a letter in his hand naming two acceptable running mates, William O. Douglas first, Harry Truman second, and that Hannigan told her the president wanted it retyped with the order of the names reversed. To her, the reason for the switch seemed obvious. By naming Truman first, it plainly implied that he was the preferred choice of the president. Hannigan would later deny making any such switch, and since the first copy of the letter was thrown away by another secretary who did the actual typing, there was no way to confirm or disprove the story. Ed Pauley, who claimed to have been with Hannigan when he went to see Roosevelt, said later that Hannigan was back at his hotel before he discovered to his horror that Douglas was even mentioned. Also, a note dated July 19th in Roosevelt's hand, as well as a typewritten duplicate on White House stationery, have survived with Truman's name listed first. But Grace Tully was not known for fabricating stories, nor was there any reason why she should have done so in this instance. In any event, the handsome, gregarious Hannigan, Mr. Busyman Bob, as he would be remembered, was playing an extremely deceitful game at this his first national convention, possibly at Roosevelt's direction and possibly not. For his next move was to call Jimmy Burns in Washington, a second call to Burns that day. The first, made by Mayor Ed Kelly in the morning, had been to tell Burns that he, Kelly, and Hannigan were no longer worried about losing the Negro vote if Burns were on the ticket, and that this was the message Hannigan would take to Roosevelt when the presidential train came in. Now, in the second call, Hannigan told Burns that the vice presidency was all set. Burns was the one. "The president has given us the green light to support you, and he wants you in Chicago." Burns left Washington for Chicago at once, and seeing Tom Connolly on the train, confided triumphantly that the nomination was his. Roosevelt himself had passed the word. "Harry Truman will nominate me," Burns said. Arriving in Chicago the morning of Sunday the 16th, Burns found a bright red fire chief's car and driver waiting at the station for him, courtesy of Mayor Kelly. He was taken directly to the mayor's apartment on Lakeshore Drive for a breakfast meeting with Kelly and Hannigan, who assured him he was the chosen man. "Well, you know Jimmy has been my choice from the very first. Go ahead and nominate him," they quoted Roosevelt as having instructed. A little afterward, Alban Barkley, too, was told by Kelly that it was in the bag for Jimmy. Hannigan and company spent most of the day with Burns mapping out strategy. Hannigan even ordered Roosevelt and Burns placards printed. By late afternoon, the word had spread among the delegates and reporters milling about in the hotel lobbies. The Roosevelt letter to Hannigan was kept secret. Hannigan was showing it to no one because of its mention of Douglas, he later said, and no one apparently had said anything about it as yet to Senator Truman, who by now had his nominating speech for Burns all prepared. Sitting beside an open window in his hotel room that evening, the flat, gray-blue panorama of Lake Michigan in the distance, Truman talked at length to a St. Louis reporter, with the understanding that most of what he said was off the record. Although Bess and Margaret, due to arrive from Denver on Tuesday, would be staying at the Morrison Hotel, the senator had taken a suite in the Stevens, across the street from the venerable Blackstone, so that his politicking would not disturb their sleep. Jimmy Burns, his candidate, was also in the Stevens, 6 flights up on the 23rd floor, in the hotel's plush Royal Skyway, the same rooms occupied a few weeks earlier by Thomas E. Dewey. He was determined to stay out of the running, Truman said. He knew his Pendergast background would be dragged out again, and he wished none of that. He had worked too hard to build a good name in the Senate. The reporter remarked that as vice president he might succeed to the throne. Truman shook his head. "Hell, I don't want to be president." He then described the failures and scorn experienced by every vice president who had succeeded to the highest office, beginning with John Tyler and overlooking the most obvious example to the contrary, Theodore Roosevelt. To another reporter that same evening, Truman repeated much the same thing. Those who had succeeded dead presidents were ridiculed in office, had their hearts broken, and lost any vestige of respect they had before. "I don't want that to happen to me." Nobody, it would seem, was avoiding the central issue of Roosevelt's health and what the vice presidential nomination really meant. Truman's Kansas City friend Tom Evans later said Truman knew perfectly well that Roosevelt's days were numbered, and this was precisely why he had no desire to be on the ticket. "I'm satisfied with where I am," Evans remembered him saying. "Just a heartbeat, this little," said Truman, making a tiny space between forefinger and thumb, "separates the vice president and the president." Since arriving in Chicago, he had hardly been able to sleep at night. He hated the thought of intrusions on his family's privacy, and what so much notoriety might do to Margaret at such an important stage in her life. He was worried about skeletons in the closet, he told Evans, about Bess being on the office payroll in Washington and what the papers would make of that. Writing years later, Margaret would say that most of all he feared what a disclosure and retelling of David Wallace's suicide would do to Bess and her mother. Evans, an old Pendergast loyalist who had grown rich with a chain of drug stores that also sold quantities of Pendergast beer and whiskey, had come to Chicago at Truman's request for the supposed purpose of helping him fend off the nomination, as had Eddie McKim and John Snyder. Scowling, heavy-handed Fred Canfield, too, was on hand in his role as general factotum and looking, noted one reporter, as if he could throw a bull in 2 falls out of 3. Canfield would later complain of missing much of the drama on the convention floor because somebody else wanted some booze and I had to help him. Yet they all seemed to have spent most of their time talking Truman up as the ideal choice. McKim liked to say it was a question of destiny, and trying to persuade Truman to change his mind. Roy Roberts, the fat, hard-drinking, opinionated editor of the Kansas City Star, who was a Republican and a man Truman loathed, also came and went, perspiring heavily and acting like a kingmaker, which aggravated Truman greatly. None of them lost sight of the point that it was really the presidency at stake. As McKim remembered, they got Truman in a room and explained the situation to him. After much talk, McKim told him, "I think, Senator, that you're going to do it." "What gave him that idea?" Truman snapped. "Because," said McKim, "there's a little old 90-year-old mother down in Grandview, Missouri, that would like to see her son President of the United States." Truman, in tears, stomped out of the room. Bess, Margaret, Mildred Dryden, his little band of Missouri friends, as well as his brother Vivian, who was in Chicago to see his first national convention, were all sure he did not want the nomination, and would all later stress how extremely stubborn he grew as pressures on him increased. Only Vic Messel, who was still out of favor but on hand as a spectator, thought differently. Truman was always politically ambitious, Messel said. I'm sure he wanted to be vice president, but he had to pretend he didn't. Reflecting on Truman's frame of mind years later, John Snyder would say that it wasn't so much that Truman didn't want to be president, but that he didn't want to succeed Franklin Roosevelt, which was different. For Truman, in memory, the convention would always be that miserable time in Chicago, the most exasperating experience of his life. Marquis Childs, a practiced Truman observer, described him as plainly scared to death. The sensation of Monday, July 17th was the release by convention chairman Samuel Jackson of Roosevelt's letter about Wallace. 100 reporters or more fought for the mimeographed copies. It had been written at Hyde Park on Friday, the same day as Roosevelt's reassuring telephone conversation with Jimmy Burns. I have been associated with Henry Wallace during his past 4 years as vice president, read the key paragraph of the instantly famous document, for 8 years earlier while he was Secretary of Agriculture, and well before that. I like him and I respect him, and he is my personal friend. For these reasons, I personally would vote for his nomination if I were a delegate to the convention. To many it seemed a kiss of death for Wallace, the coolest and cruelest brush-off in all the long Roosevelt career, in the words of one account. Unquestionably, it threw the choice of a running mate wide open. He did not wish to appear to be in any way dictating to the convention, Roosevelt had also written. If anybody benefited, said several papers, it was Jimmy Burns. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch called the letter a spur to the already soaring campaign stock of energetic little Jimmy Burns. But the Wallace forces, including Sidney Hillman and Phil Murray of the CIO, took the announcement as a sign of hope, since theirs was the only candidate who now had something in writing from the president. It was generally regarded as a Roosevelt endorsement, remembered Senator Claude Pepper of Florida, a Wallace floor leader who, from his conversations with Roosevelt in Washington, was certain Roosevelt wanted Wallace. It was only now, in response, that Hannigan began saying he too had a letter from the president which named Truman, but no one was allowed to see it. Hannigan's corner suite on the 7th floor of the Blackstone, rooms 708 to 709, had become the convention nerve center since Hannigan alone claimed direct telephone contact with the president. In the red-carpeted hall outside, reporters and photographers set up a round-the-clock vigil to see who came and went. At first Hannigan tried to discourage them, insisting that nothing was happening there. Mayor Kelly, who was in and out continually, kept mentioning the Roosevelt letter. "Do you want to see it?" he asked a skeptical representative of the United Auto Workers. "Indeed, yes," said the man. "I haven't got it with me," Kelly replied, "but I'll show it to you tomorrow." At a dinner that night arranged by Kelly in a private apartment on Chicago's North Side, a location kept secret from the press, Burns was man of the hour. It was only when everybody was about to leave that Hannigan mentioned one further detail, the need, as required by the president, to clear it with Sidney, a point Hannigan seemed to regard as only a formality. On Tuesday morning, Senator Truman and Sidney Hillman had orange juice, eggs, and bacon sent up by room service to Hillman's suite at the Ambassador East, the fancy hotel, as Truman called it. Born in Lithuania, educated to be a rabbi, Hillman had been an $8 a week apprentice pants cutter in the garment district of New York when Truman was still riding a plow on the farm. He had led his first strike at 23 and founded the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America by the time he was 30. He had also joined the Socialist Party and still spoke with a slight accent, which would have been more than enough in places like Grandview, Missouri, to have made him seem a dangerous radical. To party chiefs like Hannigan and Kelly, he was an amateur and therefore not wholly trustworthy, whatever the power of his pack or his allegiance to the president. Hillman wasn't even a registered Democrat. In addition, as co-director of the former Office of Production Management in Washington, he had come under heavy fire from the Truman Committee, which had been mainly responsible for his removal. And so Truman had no reason to expect much from him in the way of cooperation or favors. Truman asked for Hillman's support for Burns. Hillman declined and refused to be budged. He was working hard for Henry Wallace, Hillman said. If it could not be Wallace, then he wanted either William O. Douglas or Harry Truman. Truman said he was going to nominate Burns. Hillman said that would be a mistake. Truman reported directly to Burns all that Hillman had said, but Burns seemed not to care, and with reason. By reliable reports, he had already lined up more than 400 of the 589 votes needed to nominate. When Ed Flynn arrived in Chicago later that morning, Tuesday the 18th, Hannigan rushed him into a corner to say it was all over. "It's Burns." Flynn said it was no such thing and demanded a meeting of the Select Committee, the same group as the night before, which convened again in the same secret North Side apartment, except that this time Sidney Hillman was included and Jimmy Burns was not. There was only one man to nominate, Flynn insisted, and that was Harry Truman, because Harry Truman was what they had agreed to with the president. Flynn was extremely angry. "I browbeat the committee, I talked, I argued, I swore," he later wrote. Hillman declared Burns unacceptable to organized labor. Flynn said Burns would cost no less than 200,000 Negro votes in New York alone. Burns was a political liability. Roosevelt could lose the election. Everyone agreed. Hannigan, the party's chairman, Pauley, Walker, Allen, Hillman for labor, Kelly the big city boss. Reporters were to call them the Harmony Boys. Flynn put through a call to Roosevelt in San Diego, and one by one each man got on the line. In the end, Roosevelt agreed it should be Truman. Though accounts differ somewhat, this appears to be what happened next. Within a short time that evening, Burns and Truman were individually told what the president had said. Truman heard it from Hannigan, who came to his room at the Stevens, and also showed him a longhand note from the president saying, as Truman remembered, "Bob, it's Truman, FDR." A different wording from what Roosevelt had supposedly scrawled for Hannigan the night of the 11th at the White House. Also, by Truman's recollection, the note he was now shown was written on scratch paper, not an envelope. Truman doubted Roosevelt had written it. "I still could not be sure this was Roosevelt's intent," he would recall. An hour or so later, Truman went alone to the Royal Skyway to square things with Burns. He asked to be released from his promise of support. Burns said he understood perfectly, given the circumstances. Whether he would stay in the race, Burns said, was a question he would have to sleep on. When Burns tried to get through to Roosevelt by phone, he was told the president was unavailable. Word of the sudden turn in events spread fast. Ed Flynn had been in town less than a day, and everything had changed. In a long account by Turner Catledge in the New York Times the next morning, Wednesday, July 19th, opening day for the convention, was a revealing paragraph. Reports that Senator Truman was to be the choice of the anti-Wallace forces were heard in the New York State delegation. Edward J. Flynn, New York National Committeeman, in a conference with leaders, informed them that the decision of the Wallace opponents was to back Senator Truman, and that the New York delegation might be voting for him at least after the first ballot. The group agreed to accede to this decision. Burns dropped out of the race, and the talk everywhere was that the bosses killed his candidacy. In a release to the press, Burns said he was withdrawing in deference to the wishes of the president. He then left for home in a fury, feeling he had been betrayed by Roosevelt. In a parting conversation with Alban Barkley, who was scheduled to nominate the president, Burns remarked sourly, "If I were you, I wouldn't say anything too complimentary about him." Barkley was as upset as Burns, furious over Roosevelt and his games at their expense. He was sick and tired of trying to determine which shell the pea was under, Barkley told a reporter, and threatened to tear up his nominating speech and be done with the whole affair. For Truman, events were out of hand. These were 3 or 4 of the most critical days of his life, and they were beyond his control, his destiny being decided for him by others once again. Speculation now centered on him, but as his stock rose, so did objections to him because of the Pendergast connection. Jim Pendergast was prominent in the Missouri delegation, which was the first to name Truman its choice for vice president, quite against his wishes. Running into his old high school classmate Charlie Ross, now a contributing editor for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Truman said, "Feel sorry for me. I'm in a terrible fix." How much faith he had in Hannigan at this point, he never said, but to many it looked as though the young party head was out of line in taking such an overtly partisan role. He appeared to be constantly improvising, seldom sure of his ground. To prove he really did have something in writing from Roosevelt about Truman, he at last released the much-talked-of letter. This only produced more grumbling and controversy. Why hadn't he said it mentioned Truman and Douglas? His claim of an endorsement for Truman was only half true, and wasn't a half-truth as good as a lie? And how much credence should be given to a letter released on July 18th that was supposedly written on July 19th? Among those most surprised by the letter when he later saw accounts of it in the papers was William O. Douglas, who at the time of the convention was in Oregon hiking in the mountains. No one had told him he was being considered. Meantime, Henry Wallace had arrived in Chicago, and at a packed press conference at the Sherman Hotel, sitting on a table with his long legs swinging, Wallace said he was there to fight to the finish. His supporters were claiming 400 votes in the first ballot. In a secret caucus of the Political Action Committee at the Sherman, CIO President Phil Murray shook his fist and said in his deep Scottish burr, "Wallace, Wallace, Wallace, that's it. Just keep pounding." A sluggish, entirely routine first session of the convention opened just before noon inside Chicago Stadium, the same giant arena where Roosevelt had been nominated in 1932 and again in 1940. From steel girders overhead hung a huge Roosevelt portrait used in 1940, only retouched a little to make him look a bit less pale. There was a prayer, there were speeches. The real business continued at the hotels. 3. Only narrow Balboa Street separated the Stevens from the Blackstone, and it was to the Blackstone, to Hannigan's 7th-floor suite, that Truman was summoned that afternoon, Wednesday, July 19th. Hannigan, collar open, his shirt damp with perspiration, had assembled the inner core, Pauley, Walker, Kelly, Flynn, plus for the first time Boss Frank Hague of Jersey City, who had never cared particularly for Senator Truman, and who until now had been telling delegates that he didn't want Truman because his nomination would only stir up the whole boss issue. It was clearly a gathering arranged for effect, for Truman's benefit. Barclay would later refer to Hannigan as the stage manager at Chicago. The time had come for a decision from the senator. They were placing a call to San Diego. Truman sat on one twin bed. Hannigan, phone in hand, sat on the other. Whenever Roosevelt used the telephone, Truman remembered, he always talked in such a strong voice that it was necessary for the listener to hold the receiver away from his ear to avoid being deafened, so I found it possible to hear both ends of the conversation. "Bob," Roosevelt's voice boomed, "have you got that fellow lined up yet?" "No," said Hannigan. "He is the contrariest goddamn mule from Missouri I ever dealt with." "Well, you tell the senator that if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of the war, that's his responsibility." With that, Roosevelt banged down the phone. Truman said later that he was completely stunned. "I was floored. I was sunk." Reportedly, his first words were, "Oh, shit." He himself recalled saying, "Well, if that's the situation, I'll have to say yes. But why the hell didn't he tell me in the first place?" That evening, Henry Wallace made a surprise appearance on the floor of the convention, and the roar of approval from the galleries astonished everyone, including, noticeably, Henry Wallace. "Ye gods," wrote Margaret Truman in her diary. "The Missouri delegation has decided to nominate Dad for VP. Vice President Wallace is very strong, so I doubt if we win, although the South doesn't want Wallace at all." To judge by her use of the word we, Bess, too, had resigned herself to the decision. On Thursday, July 20th, an immense crowd filling the hall, the convention became a thundering, old-fashioned political circus. Alban Barclay, bathed in spotlights on the podium, his broad face streaming with perspiration, his anger at Roosevelt forgotten for the moment, delivered a fulsome tribute to the great leader that set off a demonstration lasting 40 minutes. In seconding the nomination, Henry Wallace gave one of the strongest speeches of his career, an impassioned, straight-from-the-shoulder declaration of liberal principles that brought the huge, roaring audience to its feet time after time. The only chance for the Democratic Party, he said, was to keep on its liberal course. In a political, educational, and economic sense, there must be no inferior races. The poll tax must go. Educational opportunities must come. The future must bring equal wages for equal work, regardless of sex or race. By evening, as time for the president's address approached, the crowd had grown far beyond what the arena was built to hold. It was packed to the roof with perhaps 40,000 people. Reportedly, 15,000 counterfeit tickets had been printed and distributed with the blessing of Mayor Kelly, who for all his apparent Truman fervor was secretly hoping for a Truman-Wallace deadlock so the prize would go to his own candidate, Illinois' favorite son, Senator Scott Lucas. But the ticket ploy resulted in thousands of additional Wallace supporters, many supplied by the CIO, who jammed the galleries and worked their way onto the convention floor, while thousands more milled about in the corridors. The Wallace people were determined to see the nomination decided there in the hall and not by the big boys in the smoke-filled room. The idea was to stampede the convention. Nominations for the vice presidency were scheduled for the next day, but as the evening wore on, with more speeches and fanfare for Roosevelt, the surge for Wallace kept growing. The heat inside the hall was nearly unbearable. At the Blackstone, Hannigan told Truman he might have to be nominated that night, depending whether they had the votes. They would have to be ready to move fast. Bennett Clark was supposed to nominate Truman, but no one knew where he was. Clark, whose wife had died the year before, had been drinking more than usual. Truman went to look for him. Hannigan started for the convention hall. When the speeches and roll call ended and the president was swiftly renominated, the delegates settled down to hear his speech. The familiar voice came booming from a cluster of amplifiers as the huge crowd sat watching the empty podium. Absolute silence hung over the darkened hall, even during the president's pauses. With no one on stage, the effect was eerie. Roosevelt was speaking from his railroad car in San Diego. "What is the job before us in 1944?" the great disembodied voice asked. "First, to win the war fast, to win it overpoweringly. Second, to form worldwide international organizations and to arrange to use the armed forces of the sovereign nations of the world to make another war impossible." No sooner was the speech over than a Wallace demonstration erupted. From every corner of the stadium came a chant of "We want Wallace." The organist, catching the spirit, began pumping away at the Wallace theme song, "Iowa, Iowa, that's where the tall corn grows," over and over. Ed Pauley, livid with rage, threatened to chop the wires to the amplifiers unless the tune was changed. Bob Hannigan was seen hurriedly conferring with Mayor Kelly in the Illinois delegation. Then they were both up on the podium, heads together with Chairman Jackson. To several of the Wallace floor leaders, it looked suddenly as if the time to nominate their man was then, that night, and the quicker the better. "I sat there and watched the demonstration, and I saw it growing in volume," remembered Claude Pepper, who, as head of the floor of the delegation, was positioned on the aisle. "I stood up on my seat, and I could see the whole convention hall then. And I said to myself, that's a real demonstration. So after it got into full speed and steam, I said, if we could bring this nomination up right now, we could nominate Henry Wallace." At the rear of the hall now, Hannigan had started throwing open the outer doors to let more people in, while at the same time Ed Kelly kept shouting about fire rules. Desperate to get the chairman's eye, Pepper tried hopping up and down on his chair, waving the Florida banner, but to no avail. His floor microphone had been turned off. He jumped down and started up the aisle, fighting his way through the crowd. Reporters, hundreds of delegates, and spectators saw him and knew at once what he was trying to do. If he could get to the podium, he would make the nominating speech himself with no more delay. "And then when I got to the little gate," remembered Pepper, "the little fence around the podium where the chairman presided, well, fortunately there was a railroad labor man that was minding the gate. He was a friend of mine, so he opened the gate and let me in. I got up to about the second step from the top, going just as hard as I could to get up that stairway, and I saw the chairman look over there. He had seen me coming up the aisle, and so immediately, by this time I got about nearly to the first step, the chairman said, 'Motion made. The convention adjourned. All in favor of the motion, let me know by saying aye, aye.' And that's it, and the convention's adjourned. And I, by that time, was just about to the top step, and they started roaring, 'No, no, no, no.'" Jackson later told Pepper he had hated to do what he did, but that he had promised the newspaper and radio people to hold the vice presidential decision until the next day, when they would be better prepared. Jackson admitted he had seen Pepper trying to get his attention, that he had an eye on him the whole time he was heading for the podium, and knew perfectly well why he was coming. What he did not tell Pepper was that he and Bob Hannigan had already made an agreement to shut things down that night before the Wallace people could start the nominations. The public explanation was that the decision was a matter of necessity because of fire laws. Harry Truman had witnessed none of this. He had spent the night in search of Bennett Clark, finding him finally in a room where he was not supposed to be, at the Sherman, and too drunk to say much more than hello. By then it was past midnight. "So I called Bob Hannigan," Truman remembered, "and said, 'I found your boy. He's cockeyed. I don't know whether I can get him ready or not, and I hope to Christ I can't.'" Of all those in Missouri who had kept track of Harry Truman's activities and accomplishments in the Senate over the past 9 years, none had been so attentive, appraising his every move, as his mother, Martha Ellen Truman, who remained a close reader of the congressional record and a more partisan Democrat than almost anyone he knew. Once, introducing her to a political friend, Truman told her the man had grown up in Mississippi and had never seen a Republican until he was 12. "He didn't miss much," she replied. For days now, in her small parlor at Grandview, she had been sitting close to the radio, following the convention. Interviewed by reporters, she said she did not want her son to become vice president. "He should stay in the Senate," she said emphatically. "I listened to all the Republican convention, too. They keep predicting that Roosevelt will die in office if he's elected. The Republicans hope he will. They keep saying that I'll die, too, and I'm almost 92. I hope Roosevelt fools 'em." The final session inside the stadium, Friday, July 21st, lasted 9 hours and would be described as the strangest, most bitter conclusion to a national convention in a very long time. Senator Bennett Clark, after a great deal of black coffee, a shower, and some food, had, with Hannigan's help, pulled himself together sufficiently to appear on the podium. But his speech for Truman was short and had none of his usual flair. He had moved the audience not at all. In another few weeks, as Truman had anticipated, Bennett Clark went down to defeat in the Democratic primary in Missouri, thereby ending a career in the Senate that many, including Truman, had once thought could lead to the White House. Nor were the seconding speakers much of an improvement. A labor leader from Pennsylvania said that while he did not know the senator personally, he thought Truman would make the strongest possible running mate for the reason that he was a Democrat and an American. By contrast, a vigorous speech for Henry Wallace, delivered by an Iowa judge named Richard Mitchell, touched off another noisy demonstration, and Claude Pepper, given a turn at the podium at last, made a moving plea to the Democratic Party not to repudiate the man who, more than any other, symbolized the democracy of Franklin Roosevelt. Wallace's delegate strength for the first ballot appeared to be gaining. But Hannigan, Flynn, Kelly, and the others had been working through the night, talking to delegates and applying a good deal of pressure to help them see the sense in selecting Harry Truman. No one knows how many deals were cut, how many ambassadorships or postmaster jobs were promised, but reportedly, by the time morning came, Postmaster General Frank Walker had telephoned every chairman of every delegation. The strategy of the Truman forces was to organize as many favorite son nominations as possible and thereby keep Wallace from winning on the first ballot. The result was a total of 16 nominations for vice president, and as the speeches continued through the long afternoon, delegates in groups of 2s and 3s were seen going to and from a private air-conditioned room beneath the platform, Room H, at the end of a narrow, dark hall, where, for hours, Senator Truman stood shaking hands. Only later did he emerge to join Bess and Margaret in a box just behind the podium. Henry Wallace was waiting out the session in his hotel room, in keeping with custom, but Truman sat in full view, munching on a hot dog and enjoying the spectacle. The nominating session had drawn some interesting visitors, including film stars Gloria Swanson, who occupied a box close by, and Spencer Tracy, who was besieged by autograph hunters. Among the delegates were 17 of Truman's fellow Democrats from the Senate. Ed Flynn and Frank Hague could be seen conferring on the platform, a tableau that caused some veteran observers among the press to recall earlier times when the big boys were more discreet about their conniving. But the crowds in the galleries were nothing like the night before. Mayor Kelly's police had been checking tickets, with the result that thousands of Wallace supporters had been kept out. The first ballot began at 4:30 p.m., and Wallace stayed in the lead the whole way, rolling up 429 votes to Truman's 319, with the remainder divided among Alban Barkley and the favorite sons. By the time the tally became official, it was past 6. The convention had been in session for nearly 7 hours without pause, and the crowd expected to recess for dinner before the night session. But then Chairman Jackson stepped to the microphones to announce that a second ballot would be taken at once. The convention was still in its afternoon session, which meant no tickets for the night meeting would be honored, and therefore no more Wallace crowds admitted. It was a daring stroke by Hannigan. On the second ballot, the excitement began to build almost at once. Wallace was ahead until suddenly, just as had been forecast for the second ballot, Ed Flynn delivered to Truman 74 votes from the New York delegation, which had been divided the first time around. Now Truman moved out in front. For a moment the count narrowed again, Wallace pulling to within 5 votes of Truman. Then the break came. Alabama's favorite son, Senator John Bankhead, withdrew his name and cast 22 Alabama votes for Truman, which gave Truman nearly 500. Delegates rose from their chairs. South Carolina switched 18 votes from Bankhead to Truman, and the stampede was on. Indiana, Wyoming, and Maine went over to Truman, while from the galleries came an instant roar of "We want Wallace!" Photographers were clustering about the Truman box. The senator was smiling broadly. Even Bess, who had looked intermittently grumpy and skeptical through the first ballot, was seen beaming now and turning, as requested, to pose with her husband. Margaret was jumping up and down, cheering as if at a college football game. Over in the Illinois delegation, Mayor Kelly shouted to Senator Lucas, "Christ almighty, let's get in this thing." The whole crowd was on its feet. Truman only needed one big state. Ohio announced for Truman, which would have been enough, but a delegate challenged the count, and Ohio passed. Then Senator David I. Walsh of Massachusetts declared that Massachusetts changed its vote to 34 for Truman, and that did it. Senator Harry S. Truman of Missouri, unofficially but conclusively, was the party's nominee for vice president. Illinois, a little late, piled on another 55 votes for Truman, and more states followed. Bennett Clark started a Truman procession down the aisles as a phalanx of police escorted the nominee to the platform. The official tally was running late, but at 8:14, Chairman Jackson formally announced the Truman victory. The final count was Truman, 1,031, Wallace, 105. William O. Douglas had 4 votes. The acceptance speech, one of the shortest in American political history, lasted less than a minute. The nomination was an honor for Missouri, Truman said, and an honor that he accepted with all humility. More than the speech, it was the shy, almost embarrassed way he stepped up to the bank of microphones, and the way he stood waiting for the crowd to settle down that many people would remember. He looked out at the huge hall in tumult, his glasses glinting in the spotlight. Then he stepped back slightly. "Now, give me a chance," he said. He was called the Missouri Compromise and the common denominator of the convention. To many, it had all been a sad spectacle. "I don't object to Truman," wrote Harold Ickes to Bernard Baruch, "but I react strongly against the method of his nomination and the seeming dominating position that the corrupt city bosses now have in the Democratic National Organization." The senator's Pendergast roots figured in editorials across the country. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette called him one of the weakest candidates ever nominated. Time magazine, which only the summer before had lauded his work on the Truman Committee, portrayed him now as a drab mediocrity, the mousy little man from Missouri. "Poor Harry Truman, and poor people of the United States," wrote Richard Strout in the New Republic. "Truman and the people are the ones who will suffer from that convention deal between Roosevelt and the bosses. Truman is a nice man, an honest man, a good senator, a man of great humility and a man of courage. He will make a passable vice president. But Truman as President of the United States in times like these?" Yet on balance the reaction was favorable, if not enthusiastic. For all his machine background, said the Kansas City Star, Harry Truman had unusual capacity for development. The New York Times praised his personal qualities and said he had the advantage of having been through the political mill. "He has known the dust and heat of a political campaign and has learned the art, not to be despised, of seeking that middle course which will appeal to a majority of the voters. He fought with distinction in the First World War. He has been a farmer. He has known firsthand the difficulties of a small businessman. He has had the kind of experience, in short, likely to make a realist sympathetic to the problems of the varied groups rather than to produce the doctrinaire or the zealot." Astonishingly, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch called him an excellent choice. Even Richard Strout, in his otherwise gloomy New Republic essay, took heart from the idea that Truman, while not brilliant, had character. Reflecting on the nomination in the privacy of his diary, reporter Alan Drury wrote, "On the credit side, the senator is a fine man. No one would do a better job of it in the White House if he had to. On the other side, the Pendergast background made him entirely too vulnerable to Republican attack, and no one who knows him likes to see him subjected to that kind of smearing. I think Senator Truman is one of the finest men I know." Again at Chicago, as so consistently through the Truman career, it had been the system of politics, the boss system, that counted in deciding his fate. There had been no popular boom for him for vice president, nor had personal ambition figured. As Richard Rovere wrote, no one ever contrived less at his own elevation than Harry Truman at Chicago. And as time would tell, everything considered, the system, bosses and all, had produced an excellent choice. In Independence, a few days later, 3,000 people streamed across the back lawn at 219 North Delaware to shake hands with the senator, who, in a white seersucker suit, stood beneath a blooming rose arbor beside his wife and daughter. Bess was performing the expected public role, though far from happily. At Chicago, after the nomination, as they fought their way out through the crowds to a waiting limousine, with police pushing and shoving, she had turned and glared at her husband, demanding, "Are we going to have to go through this for the rest of our lives?" On the drive home through the smothering July heat of southern Illinois, the atmosphere inside their own car was, as Margaret recalled, close to Arctic. Dad tried to be cheerful and philosophical simultaneously. Mother said little. No sooner had they arrived in Independence than Margaret's Aunt Natalie Wallace, Uncle Frank's wife, took it upon herself to tell Margaret that her grandfather Wallace had shot himself. Margaret ought to know, she said, since the story was bound to come out any time now. Shattered, disbelieving, Margaret rushed to the kitchen to ask Vieta Gar if this were true. Vieta nodded. Unable to face her mother, Margaret waited until evening to tell her father what she had heard, and for the first and only time in her life he turned his fury on her. "He seized my arm in a grip that he must have learned when he was wrestling calves and hogs around the farmyard," she remembered. "Don't you ever mention that to your mother," he said. Then Truman rocketed out the door to find Aunt Natalie. I wish I could tell you that years later I asked Mother if her anxiety about her father's death was the hidden reason for her opposition to Dad's nomination, Margaret would write years later. But to the end of her life I never felt free to violate the absolute prohibition Dad issued on that summer night in 1944. Out-of-town reporters, looking over the old gray Victorian house for the first time, saw that it needed paint. The defeated Henry Wallace immediately declared his all-out support for the ticket, exhibiting no bitterness, and in turn he was praised for his courage and forthrightness. Contrary to predictions, he had had real delegate strength after all, and had nearly carried the convention despite all the forces aligned against him. Roosevelt would have had no trouble whatever getting him nominated, had he so decided. But then no one seemed nearer to understanding Roosevelt after the convention than before. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote sympathetically to Wallace, "I had hoped by some miracle you could win out, but it looks to me as though the bosses had functioned pretty smoothly. I'm told that Senator Truman is a good man, and I hope so for the sake of the country." What was not perceived as yet, because so little was known of what went on behind the scenes at Chicago, as well as in Washington before the convention, was the critical part played by Ed Flynn. The fact that it was Flynn, more than anyone, who had convinced Roosevelt that Wallace was a liability and urged Harry Truman on him as the safest alternative. That it was Flynn, the day he arrived in Chicago, who refused to accept Jimmy Burns as a fait accompli, as Kelly and Hannigan had. That it was Flynn, with perfect timing on the second ballot, who delivered the important New York vote. Southern opposition to Wallace because of his views on racial equality was clear, as was the refusal of Northern liberals to accept the Southerner Burns for his opposing views on the same subject. What was not so clear still was the degree to which Flynn worried over the black vote in New York, the point he had stressed at the secret White House meetings in the spring. It was vital that Truman had no opposition from organized labor, as Burns did. It was important that Truman was seen by the conservative side of the party, the Southerners' side, as the kind of politician they could work with, who would go along, in the old phrase, as Wallace never could. It was also very important that Truman had no enemies, that nearly everybody liked Harry Truman, and especially in the Senate, where there would be much work to do when the war was over, and the Senate once again, as after the First War, would take part in establishing the peace. But given Ed Flynn's concern about the black vote, it was, after all, Truman's record on civil rights, his stand in the Senate against the poll tax, his Sedalia speech in 1940, his talk to black delegates at the 1940 convention, that made him the right man, a somewhat ironic turn for the son of unreconstructed Missouri lineage who would soon be accused of having once been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Roosevelt declared himself well pleased with the outcome and wired Truman his congratulations. Harry Hopkins, somewhat in contradiction to what he had told Jimmy Burns, said later that the president had had an eye on Truman all along. "People seem to think that Truman was just suddenly pulled out of a hat, but that wasn't true," said Hopkins. Bernard Baruch said that while everyone professed a willingness to do what the boss, Roosevelt, wanted, the boss did what Ed Flynn wanted. Roosevelt's son Jimmy, a Marine officer who had been with him in San Diego at the time of the nomination, later wrote of his father's irritability over what was happening in Chicago and of his apparent indifference as to whom the convention selected as a running mate. "Although father did not commit himself, I came away with the distinct impression that he really preferred Justice William O. Douglas as the vice presidential nominee. But he professed not to give a damn whether the delegates came up with Justice Douglas, Jimmy Burns, or Harry Truman." On the very day of his renomination at Chicago, Roosevelt had had a seizure, as only his son Jimmy knew. He had suddenly turned deathly pale, with a look of agony in his face. "Jimmy, I don't know if I can make it. I have horrible pains," Roosevelt said, barely able to get the words out. Jimmy helped him lie down on the floor of the railroad car and watched over him for about 10 minutes, terrified, until his father asked to be helped to his feet again. Soon afterward, the commander-in-chief was driven to a hilltop above the Pacific where, chin up, smiling, intent, he watched 10,000 Marines storm ashore from Higgins boats in a dress rehearsal for an amphibious landing. 4. On Tuesday, August 18, 1944, in the shade of a magnolia tree said to have been planted by Andrew Jackson, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman had lunch on the south lawn of the White House. Because of the heat, Roosevelt suggested they take off their jackets. So it was in their shirt sleeves, seated at a small round table set with crystal and silver from the Coolidge years, that the two men posed together for photographers for the first time. In background, interests, personality, in everything from the sounds of their voices to the kind of company they enjoyed to the patterns of their careers, they could not have been much more dissimilar. Roosevelt was now in his 12th year in office. He had been president for so long and through such trying, stirring times that it seemed to many Americans, including the junior senator from Missouri, that he was virtually the presidency itself. His wealth, education, the social position he had known since boyhood were everything Harry Truman never had. Life and customs at the Roosevelt family estate on the upper Hudson River were as far removed from Jackson County, Missouri, as some foreign land. Roosevelt fancied himself a farmer. To Truman, Roosevelt was the kind of farmer who had never pulled a weed, never known debt or crop failure or a father's call to roll out of bed at 5:30 on a bitter cold morning. Truman, with his Monday night poker games, his Masonic ring and snappy bow ties, the Main Street pals, the dry Missouri voice, was entirely undeniably Middle American. He had only to open his mouth and his origins were plain. It wasn't just that he came from a particular part of the country geographically, but from a specific part of the American experience, an authentic pioneer background, and a specific place in the American imagination. His Missouri, as he loved to emphasize, was the Missouri of Mark Twain and Jesse James. In manner and appearance, he might have stepped from a novel by Sinclair Lewis, an author Truman is not known to have read. To anyone taking him at face value, this might have been George F. Babbitt having lunch with the president under the Jackson magnolia. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was from the world of Edith Wharton stories and drawings by Charles Dana Gibson. He was the authentic American patrician come to power, no matter that he loved politics or a night of poker with the boys quite as much as the senator from Missouri, or that he too was a Mason and chose a bow tie as many mornings as not, including this one. Roosevelt had been given things all of his life: houses, furniture, servants, travels abroad. Truman had been given almost nothing. He had never had a house to call his own. He had been taught from childhood and by rough experience that what he became would depend almost entirely on what he did. Roosevelt had always known the possibilities open to him, indeed how much was expected of him, because of who he was. Both were men of exceptional determination, with great reserves of personal courage and cheerfulness. They were alike, too, in their enjoyment of people. The human race, Truman once told a reporter, was an excellent outfit. Each had an active sense of humor and was inclined to be dubious of those who did not. But Roosevelt, who loved stories, loved also to laugh at his own, while Truman was more of a listener and laughed best when somebody else told a good one. Roosevelt enjoyed flattery. Truman was made uneasy by it. Roosevelt loved the subtleties of human relations. He was a master of the circuitous solution to problems, of the pleasing if ambiguous answer to difficult questions. He was sensitive to nuances in a way Harry Truman never was and never would be. Truman, with his rural Missouri background, and partly, too, because of the limits of his education, was inclined to see things in far simpler terms, as right or wrong, wise or foolish. He dealt little in abstractions. His answers to questions, even complicated questions, were nearly always direct and assured, plainly said, and followed often by a conclusive, "And that's all there is to it," an old Missouri expression, when in truth there may have been a great deal more to it. Each of them had been tested by his own painful struggle, Roosevelt with crippling polio, Truman with debt, failure, obscurity, and the heavy stigma of the Pendergasts. Roosevelt liked to quote the admonition of his old headmaster at Groton, Dr. Endicott Peabody. "Things in life will not always run smoothly. Sometimes we will be rising toward the heights, then all will seem to reverse itself and start downward. The great fact to remember is that the trend of civilization is forever upward." Assuredly, Truman would have subscribed to the same vision. They were two optimists at heart, each in his way faithful to the old creed of human progress. But there had been nothing in Roosevelt's experience like the night young Harry held the lantern as his mother underwent surgery, nothing like the Argonne or Truman's desperate fight for political survival in 1940. Roosevelt, as would be said, was a kind of master conjurer. He had imagination. He was theatrical. If, as his cousins saw him, Harry Truman was Horatio, then Franklin Roosevelt was Prospero. Truman was often called a simple man, which he was not. "I wonder why we are made so that what we really think and feel we cover up," he had once confided to Bess, and some who knew him well would, in retrospect, feel he had withheld too much of himself from public view, and that this was among his greatest limitations. But in contrast to Franklin Roosevelt, and it was Truman's destiny from this point forward to be forever contrasted to Roosevelt, he was truly uncomplicated, open, and genuine. In private correspondence, Truman could be extremely revealing, whereas Roosevelt never dropped the mask, never poured his heart out on paper as did Truman in hundreds of letters and notes to himself, even after it was clear that he was to be a figure in history. To many Americans, Truman would always be the little man from Missouri. Roosevelt was larger than life, even in a wheelchair. He had the force of personality that Truman so admired in a leader and to a degree rarely equaled in the ranks of the presidency. This, too, was something Truman knew he did not have himself, as he knew he had no exceptional intellectual prowess, as had, say, Henry Wallace. "I am not a deep thinker as you are," he had told Wallace only a day earlier when asking Wallace for his help in the campaign ahead. Yet Truman, as Republican Congressman Joe Martin would write, was smarter by far than most people realized. In some ways, Truman would have felt more in common, more at ease, with the earlier Roosevelt, Theodore, had he been host for the lunch. They were much more alike in temperament. They could have talked books, army life, or the boyhood handicap of having to meet the world wearing thick spectacles, or possibly the old fear of being thought a sissy. Like Theodore Roosevelt and unlike Franklin, Truman had never known what it was to be glamorous. The contrast in appearance between the president and his new running mate was striking. Truman looked robust, younger than his age. The president, though only 2 years older, seemed a haggard old man. He had returned only the day before from his long mission to the Pacific, and from the sag of his shoulders, the ashen circles under his eyes, it was clear the trip had taken its toll. Truman, who had not seen the president in more than a year, was stunned by how he looked. Even the famous voice seemed to have no energy or resonance. The lunch was sardines on toast. The conversation dealt mainly with the campaign ahead and was not very private or revealing, since the president's daughter, Anna Roosevelt Bettiger, joined them. Truman would later repeat only one remark of Roosevelt's. The president told him not to travel by airplane, because it is important that one of them stay alive. To his dismay, Truman noticed that Roosevelt's hand shook so badly he was unable to pour cream in his coffee. "The president looked fine and ate a bigger lunch than I did," Truman told reporters afterward, already becoming party to the fiction of a steady hand at the helm. To Bess and Margaret, who were still in Independence, he described how Roosevelt had given him 2 roses, one for each of them. "You should have seen your pa walking down Connecticut Avenue with his hat blown up by the wind, so he looked like a college boy, gray hair and all, and 2 rosebuds in hand," he wrote, as if he hadn't a worry in the world. But arriving at his Senate office, he appeared noticeably upset. He was greatly concerned about the president, he told Harry Vaughan, and described how Roosevelt's hand had trembled so pouring his cream in his coffee that he put more in the saucer than in the cup. "His hands were shaking and he talks with considerable difficulty. It doesn't seem to be any mental lapse of any kind," Truman said, "but physically he's just going to pieces." In September, Truman took Eddie McKim to a White House reception, where McKim was so shocked by the president's appearance he wondered if Roosevelt would live long enough to be inaugurated, if Henry Wallace might become president after all. On the way out, as they were walking through the gate, McKim told Truman to turn and look back, because that was where he would be living before long. "I'm afraid you're right, Eddie," Truman said, "and it scares the hell out of me." To his cousin Laura Delano, Roosevelt would later remark that he liked Harry Truman. "Harry is a fine man, intelligent, able, and has integrity. He doesn't know much about foreign affairs, but he's learning fast." How Truman honestly felt about Roosevelt can be deduced only from odd remarks to friends or in his private notes and correspondence, and the picture that emerges, though incomplete, is not complimentary. He called him Santa Claus. He called him a prima donna and a fakir. Writing about Bernard Baruch, whom he disliked, Truman would say, "There never was a greater egotist unless it was Franklin D." Another time, describing Roosevelt to Bess, he wrote, "He's so damn afraid that he won't have all the power and glory that he won't let his friends help as it should be done." There was little subtle about Truman. He was never remote, rarely ever evasive. He had been raised on straight answers by people who nearly always meant what they said. Roosevelt wasn't that way. "You know how it is when you see the president," Truman once told Alan Drury. "He does all the talking, and he talks about what he wants to talk about, and he never talks about anything you want to talk about, so there isn't much you can do." To Republican Owen Brewster, Truman said he had but one objection to the president, and that was, he lies. Such feelings, however, would never be publicly expressed, not by Senator Harry Truman of his president, his commander-in-chief and leader of the Democratic Party. That would be unthinkably disloyal, not to say politically unwise and unprofessional. On occasion, Truman could also rise to Roosevelt's defense, and in a manner not unlike that of his father. At a meeting in Boston in a room at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel that fall, halfway through the campaign, Joe Kennedy began vilifying Roosevelt. "Harry, what the hell are you doing campaigning for that crippled son of a bitch that killed my son Joe?" Kennedy said, referring to his oldest son who had died in the war. Kennedy went on, saying Roosevelt had caused the war. Truman, by his later account, stood all he could, then told Kennedy to keep quiet or he would throw him out the window. Bob Hannigan had to step in and take Truman aside to remind him of how important Kennedy's money was to the Democratic Party. His first official speech of the campaign was delivered on a steamy, full-moon night in front of the old red-brick courthouse in Lamar, just up the street from the house where he was born. He spoke for half an hour, never once referring to himself. Experience was what the country needed in such critical times. Franklin Roosevelt was what the country needed. "You can't afford to take a chance. You should endorse tried and experienced leadership," Truman said, as if his own comparative inexperience were in no way part of the equation. And this was the theme that he carried cross-country, traveling by rail in an old combination sleeper and dining car called the Henry Stanley. Hugh Fulton, Matt Connolly, Eddie McKim, and Fred Canfill were along to assist. The youthful, handsome Connolly, whose own experience thus far had been only as an investigator for the Truman Committee, would remember how the senator recruited him as a political right-hand man. Truman came back from Chicago after the convention, and the office was a madhouse. Photographers, press, so at 5 I locked the door and said, "I think you've had enough for today." He said, "Yes, it was quite a day. Let's go back to the doghouse. I want to talk to you." There he said, "How about a drink? You like that damn scotch, don't you?" I said, "I'll mix them." He said, "No, I'm up to something. I'll mix them." So he made a drink and sat down. He said, "You know, I've got to make a campaign trip." I said, "I assumed you would." He said, "I want you to go along with me." "You want me to go along with you? What do I know about politics?" He said, "Never mind that. You've got a pretty good teacher." The route was from New Orleans through Texas and New Mexico, then up the Pacific coast to Portland and Seattle, then east all the way to Boston, with a dozen stops en route. From Boston, Truman went to New York, then Washington, where finally he turned homeward again by way of Wheeling, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. At Uvalde, Texas, the morning the train stopped, old John Nance Garner was waiting on the station platform dressed in khaki work pants and a battered 10-gallon hat, his hands stained from picking pecans. "I'm glad to see you, Harry. Bless your old soul," said the former vice president, who after falling out with Roosevelt had left Washington vowing never again to cross the Potomac River as long as he lived, a vow he kept. "Somewhere in the world it must be 12 o'clock and time for a drink," Garner speculated. Truman told him to come right aboard. In Seattle he addressed a crowd of 10,000. At Little Avery, Idaho, beside the Shoshone National Forest, only 3 women, school teachers, were waiting when the train stopped, but he spoke for 15 minutes just the same. It wasn't their fault they were the only ones there, Truman would explain. "He's just like the rest of us," said Montana Congressman Mike Mansfield, introducing Truman at a lunch in Butte. On a drive through Pittsburgh, he had a 26-man motorcycle escort and huge crowds stretching for miles. He was not an exciting speaker. It was not a colorful campaign. He just kept pounding away at the need for Roosevelt's leadership to win the war and establish the peace. There could be no return to the isolationism of the Republicans once the war was over, no Congress in the control of Republicans like Nye and Taft. To one reporter on the train, it was the farmer neighborliness, the genuineness of the candidate that made him appealing and believable, far more than anything he said. Once, on the train, he was wrenched from his sleep by a vivid nightmare. He had dreamt Roosevelt was dead, and he, Harry Truman, was president. The Republicans tried hard to make him an issue. "Clear it with Sidney" became a Republican war cry. But all efforts by Republicans and reporters to turn up something unsavory from his Pendergast years came to nothing. Bess's Senate salary was reported and deplored just as he had feared. He was portrayed repeatedly as small-time backwater Harry, the failed haberdasher. He couldn't even make good selling shirts. A rumor spread that he was part Jewish, again as in years past on the basis that he had a grandfather named Solomon. He was not Jewish, Truman responded, but if he were, he would never be ashamed of it. The charge that he had been a member of the Klan, which he categorically denied, appeared first in the Hearst papers. The story broke shortly before he reached Boston, where, with the Irish Catholic vote at stake, it might have done irreparable harm. To Truman and his entourage there was no question that the story had been purposefully planted to hit Boston just in time for his arrival, and that the day was only saved by the celebrated former governor of Massachusetts, James Michael Curley, then a member of Congress, who spoke from the same platform with Truman. Jim Curley got up to make his little speech, remembered Matt Connolly, for whom it was one of the memorable moments of the campaign. And he said, "We have a very unusual candidate for vice president. He goes to California, the word comes back to us he's a Jew. He arrives in the Midwest, the word comes back to us that he's a member of the Klan." And he turned. "Mr. Vice President, I invite you to join my lodge, the Ancient Order of Hibernians. We'd be glad to have you as one of our members, and I assure you, we will get out the vote." I said to Mr. Truman, "That takes care of the Klan." But it was the old Pendergast Association that dogged him most, and especially when coupled with the question of Roosevelt's health. Attacks by the Chicago Tribune were sharpest of all. "If they confess that there is the slightest chance that Mr. Roosevelt may die or become incapacitated in the next 4 years, they are faced with the grinning skeleton of Truman the bankrupt, Truman the pliant tool of Boss Pendergast in looting Kansas City's county government, Truman the yes-man and apologist in the Senate for political gangsters." To the immense relief of the Trumans, nothing was said of the death of Bess's father, and Truman's anger erupted only over remarks by Republican Congresswoman Claire Booth Luce, the glamorous wife of publisher Henry Luce, who, poking fun at the idea of Bess working on his Senate staff, began calling her Payroll Bess. If, as Truman had said, his mother didn't bring him up to be a statesman, then she would not be disappointed, Mrs. Luce also declared. In the normal rough and tumble of a campaign, Truman could take nearly anything said about him, but at any mention of his family, even an implied slight, he got hotter than a depot stove. He would have nothing but contempt for Claire Booth Luce from that point on, commenting privately that she spelled her name Loose. Between Truman and the White House there was little or no communication. The real battle, after all, was the one Roosevelt was waging against Dewey, and to the delight of those close to the president, the battle revived him wonderfully. Though he made few public appearances, one before the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in Washington was considered the best campaign speech of his entire career. He seemed his old self, spontaneously adding a little extra to the prepared text, delivering it with great feigned gravity and savoring the moment as only a seasoned performer could. These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me or my wife or on my sons. No, not content with that, they now include my little dog, Fala. Well, of course, I don't resent attacks, and my family doesn't resent attacks. But, pause, Fala does resent them. As Robert Sherwood, his speechwriter, later observed, the Fala story put the needed excitement into the campaign. The champ was back. Ed Flynn, after all his anguish and exertions over the choice of a vice president, would later tell friends that Roosevelt was in such fine form in the campaign that he could have won had he put Fala on the ticket. The night the president spoke in Chicago, more than 100,000 people packed Soldier Field. He improved visibly in strength and resilience, recalled Sherwood. In New York, in the face of a cold, driving rain, he rode for hours in an open car, bareheaded, so millions of people could see him with their own eyes and know he was all right. It was an ordeal that could have put a younger, stronger man in the hospital, but at the end Roosevelt seemed exhilarated, glad for the chance to show what he could take. Dewey had raised the specter of communist infiltration in Washington. Now, with the aid of Sidney Hillman, the communists are seizing control of the New Deal to control the government of the United States, Dewey warned. Roosevelt had grown to detest Dewey as he never had a political opponent, and like the driving rain, this too seemed to brace him up. The Trumans waited out the returns in Kansas City, in a suite at the Mulebach, a throng of old political and Battery D friends on hand to help celebrate, and before the long night ended, a large number of them were extremely drunk. I was shocked, remembered Margaret. One old political friend from southwest Missouri, Harry Easley, stayed on with Truman after everyone had left. Stretched out on a bed, Truman talked of how lonely he had felt through the campaign. He had seen the look of death in Roosevelt's face, Truman said. And he knew that he would be president before the term was out, Easley remembered. He said he was going to have to depend on his friends, people like me, he said. He knew that he was going to be the president of the United States, and I think it just scared the very devil out of him, even the thought of it. It was nearly 4 a.m. before Dewey conceded, and the victory was narrow, the closest presidential election since 1916. The Roosevelt-Truman ticket won by 3 million votes, carrying 36 of the 48 states. Yet a shift of just 300,000 votes in the right states would have elected Dewey and Bricker. Dewey asked all Americans to join him in the hope that, in the difficult years ahead, divine providence will guide and protect the President of the United States. Roosevelt, before turning in at Hyde Park, said, "I still think he is a son of a bitch." In deference to the tragedy of war and the President's limited strength, the inauguration at noon, January 20th, 1945, was a somber affair lasting less than 15 minutes. It was the first wartime inauguration since Lincoln, and the first ever held at the White House, the ceremony conducted on the South Portico before a crowd that included numbers of disabled soldiers. A thin crust of snow covered the lawn. The day was grim. There were no parades. The red jackets of the Marine Band were the one note of cheer in the whole chill, muted scene. Truman, wrapped in a heavy dark blue overcoat, his shoulders braced as if at attention, took the oath of office from Henry Wallace, a serious look on his face. Then the President was helped to his feet by his Marine son, Jimmy, and a Secret Service agent. Roosevelt only wore a thin summer-weight suit and moved slowly, stiff-legged from his braces, until he could reach out and grip the edge of the lectern. Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, standing close by, was suddenly reminded of how her husband had looked when he went into his decline. 5. Truman was vice president for 82 days and as busy as he had ever been, doing what was customarily expected of a vice president, presiding over the Senate, attending parties and receptions, shaking endless numbers of hands. Roosevelt was out of the country until the end of February. He had slipped away from Washington in strictest secrecy just 2 days after the inauguration, traveling by rail to Norfolk, where the cruiser Quincy carried him to the Mediterranean Sea, to the island of Malta. From Malta he went by plane to the old Black Sea health resort of Yalta, for his second Big Three conference with Churchill and Stalin. Jimmy Burns had gone too as a special advisor, and so had Ed Flynn as a kind of official stowaway. Vice President Truman had been told only that if it was absolutely urgent, he could make contact with the president through the White House. Since taking office, Truman had seen nothing of Roosevelt, nor had he been told anything at all about the conference. Truman had not even met the new Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius. To his surprise, however, he was enjoying himself. The round of social engagements not only didn't bother him, he delighted in it. The amiable Missourian with a touch of country in his voice and manner, reported Time, had conquered a schedule that had Mrs. Truman and Capital Society writers breathless. Pearl Mesta, heir to Oklahoma oil money and the widow of a wealthy Pittsburgh toolmaker, gave a party in the vice president's honor that was described as one of the most glittering in Washington's long history of glittery parties. Mrs. Mesta had come to Washington initially as a Republican, but jumped the fence to become a Democrat only the summer before because the Republicans had refused to renominate Wendell Willkie. Now she had taken up Harry Truman. The party had all the charm of an English court tea, the sparkle of a Viennese ball, and the razzle-dazzle of a Hollywood premiere. The best names in officialdom and society attended. Shirt fronts gleamed with star ruby studs, evening gowns fairly dripped with diamonds and pearls. Champagne at $20 a bottle flowed in cascades. He circulated around in as comfortable, unpretentious, and agreeable manner as could be, wrote the author John Gunther, after seeing Truman at a dinner party given by the foreign affairs editor of the Washington Post. Truman had been the first to arrive, Gunther noted. He was lively and animated, a guest among other guests. I had the impression of what you might call bright grayness. Both the clothes and hair were neat and gray. The gray-framed spectacles magnified the gray-hazel eyes, but there was no grayness in the mind. His conversational manner is alert and poised. He talks very swiftly, yet with concision. You have to listen hard to get it all. Later, during an interview on the Hill, when Gunther asked him what he liked most, Truman answered, "People." Old friends on the Hill found him wholly unaffected by his new role, homespun as ever. He kept his same quarters in the Senate Office Building, room 240, using the Vice President's office in the Capitol mainly as a place to greet visitors, under the dazzle of a 7-tiered crystal chandelier. For senators of both parties it became, as Charlie Ross wrote, the most natural thing in the world to drop in on Truman for a chat or perhaps a nip of bourbon. Many of them observed on these occasions that they had never been in the Vice President's office when Henry Wallace was there. Wallace to them was otherworldly. He didn't speak their language. Truman does. He, Bess, and Margaret were still living in the same 5-room apartment at 4701 Connecticut Avenue at the same $120 a month rent. The only difference was that his mother-in-law, Mrs. Wallace, had also moved in. "Harry looks better than he has for ages, is really putting on weight," Bess wrote to Ethel Noland. "Marge has gone to a picture show and Harry to a poker party," she told Ethel in another letter. "Mother is practically asleep in her chair, so it's very peaceful." The one new personal convenience with the job was an official car, a black Mercury limousine, and a driver, Tom Hardy, who picked up the Vice President each morning and returned him home again at day's end. En route to the Capitol, they would drop Margaret off at George Washington University, where she was in her junior year. Also in the front seat rode a young man whom Truman at first assumed was a friend of Hardy's who needed a lift. He was George Drescher, the first Secret Service man to be assigned to a vice president. The idea had been suggested by Harry Vaughn, who had returned from active duty with the Air Corps to become Truman's military aide, another first for a vice president. Appalled to find that no security arrangements had been made for Truman, Vaughn went to Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau and told him it seemed a bit incongruous to have 70 or 100 people guarding the president and no one at all guarding the vice president. "I used to get down here to the office at 7 o'clock, Truman wrote his mother and sister from his office. "But now I have to take Margaret to school every morning, and I don't get here until 8:30. Rethel Odom, who'd replaced Mildred Dryden as his stenographer, is always here at that time, and we wade through a stack of mail a foot high. By that time I have to see people, one at a time, just as fast as they can go through the office without seeming to hurry them. Then I go over to the Capitol gold-plated office and see senators and curiosity seekers for an hour, and then the Senate meets and it's my job to get 'em prayed for, and goodness knows they need it, and then get the business going by staying in the chair for an hour and then see more senators and curiosity people who want to see what a VP looks like and if he walks and talks and has teeth." What inner fear or concern Truman still felt over the president's health, he seems to have kept to himself. Nor did he appear to be making any effort to prepare himself for Roosevelt's death. It was as if all the dire speculation of the summer before, the nightmare he had had on the campaign train, were forgotten, locked away, now that the unthinkable was so much nearer at hand. The closest he came to open speculation on the future and its problems was an off-the-record conversation with a correspondent for Time, Frank McNaughton, who later wrote to his editor in New York. Truman says simply that he hopes to be of value to the administration through his contacts in the Senate, and he conceives the VP's job to be a sort of liaison between the executive and legislative branches. Truman is fervent in his declared hope that he can do this right up to the hilt. There is a difficult situation after every war, and disagreements and misunderstandings spring up between the executive and legislative, Truman, an expert on history, says. Madison encountered it, Andrew Jackson experienced it in an aggravated degree, and Woodrow Wilson had to struggle with it. There is always a tremendous reaction after every such emergency. I don't think the human kind has changed so much in that regard, but I have hopes that this will be a period in history when all will rise to the seriousness of the occasion and cooperate for the good of this country and the people. We can't attribute it to Truman, but he is tremendously afraid that there will be a post-war struggle between executive and legislative and between the Allied powers that will wreck the peace once and for all. He believes it is going to take the greatest sagacity and diplomacy to prevent post-war national and international struggles for power and prestige, and he conceives it to be his job to effect, to the best of his ability, a smooth cooperation and liaison between the Senate and the President. His more immediate task was to help get Henry Wallace approved by the Senate as the new Secretary of Commerce. However, it was his part in two other events, both occurring in Roosevelt's absence, that drew the greatest attention. In Kansas City on January 26th, less than a week after the inauguration, Tom Pendergast died at the age of 72. Since his return from prison nearly 5 years before, Pendergast had been living in the big house on Ward Parkway, where his wife kept him confined to the servants' quarters and refused to speak to him. All but broke, he was restricted also, by court rulings, from ever setting foot again at 1908 Main Street. Almost no one came to see him except his son, who of the whole family remained loyal. Truman is not known ever to have called on him from the time T.J. left prison, but then to have done so would have been extremely difficult. But on hearing of T.J.'s death, Truman decided at once that he would attend the funeral. He took off for Kansas City in an Army bomber and was among the several thousand mourners who filed past the bier at Visitation Catholic Church. He was photographed coming and going and paying his respects to the family, all of which struck large numbers of people everywhere as outrageous behavior for a vice president, to be seen honoring the memory of a convicted criminal. Yet many, possibly a larger number, saw something admirable and courageous in a man risen so high who still knew who he was and refused to forget a friend. 2 weeks later he was back in the news with more pictures, and again, to some, as a figure of ridicule. He had agreed to take part in a stage show for servicemen held at the Washington Press Club's canteen. He was playing an upright piano to an audience of about 800 men in uniform, when actress Lauren Bacall, also part of the entertainment, was boosted on top of the piano to strike a leggy pose as the delighted crowd cheered and flashbulbs popped. "I was just a kid," she would remember. "My press agent made me do it." "Anything can happen in this country," a soldier was quoted at the time. The photographs of the vice president serenading the glamorous Hollywood star were an instant sensation. What disturbed many people was that Truman appeared to be having such a good time, which he was. Bess was furious. She told him he should play the piano in public no more. On March 1st, in the House chamber, at a solemn joint session of Congress with Majority Leader John McCormick beside him, Vice President Truman sat on the dais behind the president as in slow, often rambling fashion Franklin Roosevelt reported on some of what had happened at Yalta. He read the speech sitting down, explaining it was easier not to carry 10 pounds of steel on his legs, which was the first time he had made public mention of his physical disability. He appeared more pale and drawn than ever. His left hand trembled noticeably as he turned the pages. "It has been a long journey. I hope you will also agree it has been so far a fruitful one." At times, losing his place, he ad-libbed. "Of course there were a few other little matters, but I won't go into them here." At times his voice seemed to give out and his hand shook again as he reached for a glass of water. 25 years ago, American fighting men looked to the statesmen of the world to finish the work of peace for which they fought and suffered. We failed. We failed them then. We cannot fail them again and expect the world to survive again." Here and there in the chamber, listening to him speak, were more than a few who knew enough to have sensed what meaning could lie in these last words. John McCormick, Minority Leader Martin, Secretary Stimson, General Marshall, Henry Wallace, Jimmy Burns, Sam Rosenman, who had written much of the speech, Steve Early, the President's press secretary, and Eleanor Roosevelt, who was watching from the gallery, perhaps a dozen in total who knew the great secret about which the Vice President had been told nothing. "I saw the President immediately after his speech had been concluded," Truman wrote. "Plainly, he was a very weary man." Roosevelt, as he told Truman, was leaving as soon as possible for Warm Springs, Georgia, and a rest. In the stack of mail on his desk to be answered the morning of Thursday, April 12th, was a letter from Jim Pendergast, who needed his old friend Harry's help. "For about a year," Jim wrote, "the Pendergast Wholesale Liquor Company has been trying to get bottles and cartons in order to carry on their business. They have made 3 applications, and these applications have all been approved by the local office of the War Production Board, but when they get to Washington, they have all been rejected." The company, Jim explained, had over 11,000 barrels of straight bourbon whiskey stored in Kentucky, but no bottles or cartons. The situation was serious. "We will see what we can do right away," Truman dictated to Miss Odom. He had dressed for the day with customary care, in a double-breasted gray suit with a white handkerchief in the breast pocket neatly folded so that 3 corners were showing, a white shirt, and a dark blue polka-dot bow tie. He looked scrubbed and well-barbered, the picture of health and self-possession. In the Senate chamber later in the day, reporters in the press gallery would comment on his obvious enjoyment of people as he moved among different groups of senators on the floor. "It's wonderful, this Senate," he had said in a press conference only the day before. "It's the greatest place on earth, the grandest bunch of fellows you could ever find anywhere." The rest of the mail took longer than usual, so that he was late getting over to the Senate chamber, where the day's work had already begun, Alban Barkley substituting for him on the dais. The time of Truman's arrival was approximately 11:30 a.m. Senator Willis of Indiana was just relinquishing the floor. Truman and Barkley shook hands, and Truman, taking his seat, handed a few official communications to the reading clerk, who announced them to the Senate. One concerned plans being made by the town of Patton, Pennsylvania, for a welcome home celebration in honor of General George S. Patton. Another was a request for the legislature of Alaska to increase the reindeer herds in Alaska's national parks by declaring open season on wolves and coyotes. Many of those in the chamber were people Truman had known since he first came to the Senate 10 years earlier. And for all that the world had changed, all the tumult and tragedy of the war, the old room itself looked much the same, except for a mass of ugly steel girders overhead, supports put up in 1940 to hold an old ceiling that had been on the verge of collapse. They had been installed as a temporary expedient only, but then, because of the war, the restoration work had to be postponed, and so there they remained, barn rafters, beneath which the business of the Senate continued. Senator Hawks of New Jersey asked for printing in the Congressional Record of a petition from the Order of the Sons of Italy to invite Italy to the forthcoming San Francisco Conference to organize the United Nations. Senator Reed of Kansas asked that 19 letters and telegrams be printed in the record, all describing the critical shortage of boxcars for grain shipments. The boxcar situation, said the senator, was the worst he had ever seen. Wheat was spoiling on the ground. The main business before the Senate was the ratification of a water treaty with Mexico, affecting use of the Colorado and Rio Grande. As chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Connolly spoke first, followed by Ernest McFarland of Arizona. Both urged ratification. Truman had a page deliver a note to Republican Senator Saltonstall of Massachusetts, asking Saltonstall to come up and take his place. "I have a Missouri soldier boy in my office," explained Truman, who promised to be back in no more than an hour. Noticing an apple on the dais, Saltonstall asked what would happen if he ate it. "You will take the consequences," Truman said. Truman had always been a man of his word, Saltonstall would remember, telling the story years later. He was back in an hour. At another point, the vice president was seen in a friendly huddle with Republicans Wiley of Wisconsin and Wary of Nebraska. Alan Drury, watching from the press gallery, remarked to Tony Vaccaro of the United Press that Roosevelt was fortunate to have so good a man as Truman to deal with the Senate. Vaccaro, frowning, said Roosevelt would make no use of him. Vaccaro, who had lately been spending time with the vice president, said, "Truman doesn't know what's going on. Roosevelt won't tell him anything." As the record would show, Truman had met with the president exactly twice, except for cabinet meetings, since becoming vice president, once on March 8th and again on March 19th, 10 days before Roosevelt left for Warm Springs, and neither time was anything of consequence discussed. About midway through the afternoon, Senator Alexander Wiley, Republican of Wisconsin, commenced his remarks on the Mexican water issue, speaking not always to the point and in numbing detail when he did. It may be noted that the report of the Bureau of Reclamation of the problems of the Imperial Valley and vicinity considered that 800,000 acres ultimately would be irrigated in Mexico, and that some storage would be required for this purpose. Under the present duty of water in the Mexico area, the 800,000 acres of land would require a diversion from the river of 4,800,000 acre-feet of water. The aggregate acreage under the two items to which the footnote in the above table applies is... Truman decided to make other use of his time by writing a letter to his mother and sister, even though he had little news to report. Dear Mama and Mary, I am trying to write you a letter today from the desk of the President of the Senate while a windy senator from Wisconsin is making a speech on a subject with which he is in no way familiar. Hope you are having a nice spell of weather. We've had a week of beautiful weather, but it is raining and misting today. I don't think it's going to last long. Hope not, for I must fly to Providence, Rhode Island, Sunday morning. Turn on your radio tomorrow night at 9:30 your time, and you'll hear Harry make a Jefferson Day address to the nation. I think I'll be on all the networks, so it ought not to be hard to get me. It will be followed by the President, whom I'll introduce. Hope you are both well and stay that way. Love to you both. Write when you can. Harry. At the conclusion of Wiley's speech, Barclay moved for a recess. It was 4 minutes to 5 by the clock over the main lobby entrance. Truman came down from the dais, went out through the swinging doors on his left, crossed the senator's private lobby, and stepped into the vice president's office to tell Harry Vaughn that he would be with Sam Rayburn should anybody want him. Then, eluding his Secret Service guard, the vice president walked the length of the Capitol, cutting through the Senate reception room, out past the 8-foot white marble statue of Benjamin Franklin, down the long, tiled corridor, around Mark Twain's cuspidor, the columned well of the Senate rotunda, so named by Twain because of the tobacco leaves on its columns, on through the main rotunda under the dome, through Statuary Hall, the old House chamber, and briefly along another corridor to a stairway, down the stairs to the ground floor, left down one hall, right down another to Room 9, Sam Rayburn's private hideaway, known unofficially as the Board of Education. Rayburn, who referred to it simply as downstairs, met there for a libation every afternoon, once the formal business of upstairs was concluded. It was an important part of his day, and to be invited to join him, even once or twice in a term, was considered the sign that one had arrived. Truman was among the regulars. Moving along at his usual brisk pace, he would have covered the distance from the vice president's office in less than 3 minutes, so it must have been just after 5 o'clock when he came in. Though pictured often as small and plain, the room was about 20 feet in length, its ornate ceiling busy with painted birds and animals. The furnishings, too, were large, comfortable, and utilitarian. Big, worn black leather chairs, a long couch, a sink, and a large refrigerator that was camouflaged with veneer to more or less match the big desk where Rayburn kept the whiskey. 2 others were already with the Speaker when Truman arrived, Louis Deschler, the House parliamentarian, and James M. Barnes, a staff man at the White House assigned to congressional liaison. The gray afternoon outside was fading, the room growing dim. No one had bothered yet to turn on the lights. Apparently it was Deschler who reminded Rayburn that Truman had had a call from the White House. "Steve Early wants you to call him right away," Rayburn said. Truman mixed himself a drink, then dialed the number. National 1414. "This is the VP," he said. Steve Early's voice sounded tense and strange. Truman was to come to the White House as quickly and as quietly as he could, and to enter by the main entrance on Pennsylvania Avenue. As Louis Deschler later recounted, Truman lost all his color. "Jesus Christ and General Jackson," he said, putting down the phone. He was wanted at the White House right away, he told the others. They must say nothing. He went out the door alone. Then he began to run, taking a different route. He kept to the ground floor this time, racing down a hall between a double line of bronze and marble Civil War generals and forgotten state governors, his shoes pounding on the marble floor. He ran through the echoing old crypt, past the Senate barber shop, then up a flight of stairs with brass banisters to his office, to get his hat. He told Harry Vaughn he was on his way to the White House and to keep that to himself. In minutes he was in the big Mercury with Tom Hardy driving, but still no Secret Service guard, moving with all possible speed through the evening traffic. By now it was approximately 5:15 p.m. What thoughts were rushing through his mind he never fully revealed. "I thought I was going down there to meet the president," he later said. "I didn't allow myself to think anything else." To his mother he would write it occurred to him that perhaps Roosevelt had returned from Warm Springs because the retired Episcopal Bishop of Arizona, an old friend of the president's, had been buried that day. "I thought that maybe he wanted me to do some special piece of liaison work with the Congress and had sent for me to see him after the funeral." But if this was so, why had he run back to his office? "I ran all the way," he told her. What did he imagine he was running toward, or leaving behind? At the White House, the long black car turned off Pennsylvania, through the northwest gate, and swept up the drive, stopping under the north portico. The time was 5:25. 2 ushers were waiting at the door. They took his hat and escorted him to a small oak-paneled elevator, more like an ornate cage, that had been installed in the Theodore Roosevelt era and that ascended now very slowly to the second floor. In the private quarters across the center hall in her sitting room, Mrs. Roosevelt was waiting. With her were Steve Early and her daughter and son-in-law, Anna and John Bediger. Mrs. Roosevelt stepped forward and gently put her arm on Truman's shoulder. "Harry, the president is dead." Truman was unable to speak. "Is there anything I can do for you?" he said at last. "Is there anything we can do for you?" she said. "For you are the one in trouble now."